So this is a quick introduction to nut graphs, and as I've mentioned in class once or twice, I tend to use a lot of outdated language. So in old journalistic speak, and especially when people were putting together pages on linotypes and other kinds of machines, they would shorten paragraph to graph and spell it with an F. And a nut graph is a convention that's generally attributed to the Wall Street Journal in the 1940s and 1950s, coming up with analytical features where there's a single point in the story that would distill the story to its essence and sell the reader on keeping it going. That is the idea of getting your story down to a single sentence or a single question. I talk about this being the heart of the story, the thing that you build the rest of your story's skeleton and body around. It's also the last chance that you have really to hook the reader and make her decide whether or not she's going to read till the very end of it. So it's an absolutely crucial point to have a lead, a nut graph, and top matter, headline and subhead that all work together. And this is an idea that obviously, here's at the end of the quote. I cannot remember, unfortunately, where I got the quote from. But you want to give the readers just enough information so they can see where the story is heading without giving the whole thing away to them. The questions you want to ask yourself is, does your nut graph sell the story as well as it could? Does that paragraph right below the lead, whatever type form your lead takes, does it distill the story down to the point where someone really wants to read it? And is it focused on the main points of the story, the characters, or the problems that those characters are facing? As I've gone over in class time and time again, you want your sentences to have characters as your subjects, not abstractions. So the nut graph needs to focus in on people hopefully as well as possible. Sometimes, of course, if you have learned AP style and thinking about leading with the who, what, when, where, why, that's when your lead and your nut graph are going to be the same thing. And sometimes that's okay. In feature writing, it generally is not the case. Let me show you a few examples here. We talked about this story a little bit in class, but this is from the New York Times. It's a profile about Silicon Prairie. It starts with this anecdote about this guy, Ben Milne, but then it has a perfectly constructed nut graph right here that explains that startups and IT firms are booming in the Midwest. So from Des Moines to Omaha to Kansas City, your region for Barnes, a startup tech scene is burgeoning. Dozens of new ventures are laying roots, investors committing money to them, and state governments are trying to, and they're calling it Silicon Prairie. That is just a perfect example of a nut graph. Another example, just to show you all, I don't just read news magazines in the New York Times. But if you look at this piece on Beyonce, it's actually a little bit complicated because the story was written before the whole foo-for-all over her lip-syncing the national anthem and then what she did at the Super Bowl. So we have this preference, we skip over all of this. It leads with a quote, which I don't recommend, but we'll talk about that later. And it goes to rainy winter evening, the camera rolls, a wind machine blasts, etc. And then it gets to here, and here's another very solid nut graph. Beyonce knows what the photographer wants. That preternatural sense is how you sell tens of millions of records and get mega endorsement deals and become one of the most iconic entertainers of your generation. This is totally gushy. I am not a big fan of the story, but the structure of it is absolutely spot on. Another example from The Atlantic. This is a guy named Jim Fallows, who's one of the best reporters working today. Mr. China comes to America, and we're talking about manufacturing coming back to the States. And it's written in the first person, which I don't recommend unless you really know what you're talking about, and that certainly applies to Jim Fallows. Goes through here, goes through here, goes through here, but you know what? There's really not a nut graph in this piece. It's just this guy narrating it. But instead, if you go back up to the subhead here, look at this. For decades, every trend in manufacturing favored the developing world and worked against the United States. But new tools that greatly speed up development from idea to finished product encourage startup companies to locate here, not in Asia. Could global trade winds be blowing back toward America again? So again, don't try this at home, but this is a perfectly good example of the way a subhead can actually function as a nut graph. Not every story you're going to read has a nut graph, but your best stories are going to have some quick précis that grabs you and sells you on a story, that makes you decide whether this is something you want to keep reading or not. Why are we focusing on nut graphs here before we really even start writing our stories? Well, the reality is that you ought to have something, some basic sentence, some basic concept that is going to drive your reporting and help you organize a to-do list. And I talk about this as being a working nut graph, as the story that you think you're writing. It's a hypothesis. It is not the end-all be-all because your story will undoubtedly change during your reporting. But you ought to have a pretty good idea of what it is that you are going after. But you have to be open to change and recognize that you may find things that prove your hypothesis wrong and force you to identify a different hypothesis, just like the scientific method. And so you have to be willing to let go of something you've invested some time and research in and know when to tear up your nut graph and start over. But nut graphs are a great way to start working on a story and a great way to develop your work plan of the people you have to talk to, the research you have to do, and everything else that needs to go into your story. So that's in a nutshell talking about nut graphs. As always, let me know if you have any questions.